again, hi everyone. So I'm Sahar Ansary. In terms of my background, I am a master's of engineering. So I did a bachelor's and a master's in the field of mechanical fluid dynamics space. Local Montrealer, so I went to McGill, Concordia. And since then, basically my journey has led me through into the world of non-dilutive funding for the tech space. So the way it started, really, I was working a bit in the aerospace industry. Then I started working with R&D partners, my current firm, where we were really working in the consulting space with tech companies on tax credits, grants, and other sources of funding. Through that work, and I've been in this space for over 13 years now, I also co-founded a company called Fundica that is really an AI search engine for the identification of non-dilutive funding. We've pivoted a few times in terms of the revenue model and the business model. Currently, it's a solution that's being white labeled to financial institutions. And so it is a tool that they're integrating into their platforms in order to capture some information on the back end, as well as aid their customer base in the identification. Otherwise, in terms of my day-to-day now, I am currently a partner at R&D Partners, which again is a firm working with tech companies. So really from small, one person with an idea up to large multinationals across Canada. We service the tech companies in that space from different industries, I would say from AI, software, biomedical, pharmaceutical, defense, aerospace. It goes across the board. And really my focus is on helping them both identify the different sources of funding and then help them obtain them. So apply for them and then go into the audit defense in the event of an audit for those different sources of funding. And we'll get into what that means and what that is. But in terms of our firm's experience, so I'm now a partner. We've worked on thousands of files, over 300 million claimed, and over 15 years in business. The team is a mix of technical, so engineers, scientists, and on the other side, tax and finance, really to bring together that expertise to help us on the funding side for companies. So it's a little bit on me. In terms of today's agenda and the presentation, so it is the 5 W's of funding. So 5 W's being the who, what, where, when, why. And so we'll touch on each of those. At a high level, we're going to go, it's meant to be really a little bit of a funding 101, I will say. So it's an introductory to the world of non-dilutive funding. So I'm really focusing on the tax credits and the grant side rather than the dilutive, which would really be more so on the equity and focusing on the government programs. So if you are familiar with some of the big grants and tax credits and you applied for some of this stuff you'll probably know, but hopefully I can add a little bit of more color and you'll learn something. And otherwise, if you're kind of just starting to dive into this, hopefully this will be a good introduction as well. In terms of the agenda, so first we'll go through what are the different types and who provides them, get into how or the best approach to getting funded, what is being funded, so what are the main areas of funding. I'm going to go through some of the top programs that we see in terms of tax credits and grants that are applicable and that work well, really. That's what I would say, low-hanging fruit to a certain extent. So if you're interested in those, and by all means, if you have further questions, I'll go pretty high level, but I'm available to speak on that. And then talk about, how do we stack these? How can we combine some of these funding programs? How can we best maximize them? And then I'll show you a little bit on Fundica, which is also available through the R&D Partners website for you to search for sources of funding for your business. So you can go in and make a profile. It's completely free. You just need to create an account and it allows you to do that search on your own. I think the other thing I'll mention is, feel free to ask questions as we go. If you also, so don't hesitate to stop me. We can do the Q&A at the end, but I'm happy to answer anything during. I'll actually just open the chat here. So in case I see anything, I can always answer. But yeah, it's always fun to do it interactive if we can too. All right, I'll go to the next. So let's get this going. So really starting with the different types of funding. So this is the basics just for the the rest of our conversation here. But I think it's important to talk about, how and when do you apply for these different types? What do they consist of? What's the difference between them, right? So if we start with the different types of funding, from the top here, we have tax credits. So tax credits are really programs that are in the law that you can apply for only after you've incurred the expense. So the idea here with a tax credit is typically you would always claim it within your tax return as a corporation. You get to decide, of course, in the first years when you set your fiscal year end. A lot of companies go with December to keep it simple with the calendar, but let's say you do have a December year end, you would incur expenses. So you would have salaries, you'd buy materials, you'd hire contractors to work on your project that may be eligible for a tax credit. And then at the end of the year, you're looking back saying, how much did I spend on what? And if it fits within that tax credit, I can claim the tax credit and get a refund. There's two types of tax credits, which is important to know because often people think tax credit, they think, well, I'm not really paying corporate taxes, so I don't need a tax credit or it doesn't make sense. But really tax credits are based on expenses. Yes, the presentation will be available. I can share, and I think it's being recorded as well. So two types. So one is a refundable tax credit, which means that really it's a refund on the expenses that you incurred and spent. So it's a check that's being issued to you, to the company, and you get to deposit and reinvest into the activities of the company. A non-refundable tax credit, that's where it truly is against corporate taxes owed. In the event that you don't have any corporate taxes owed, it can always be carried forward. So depending on the program, you can carry it forward up to 20 years, accumulate them, and in the year that you are profitable, you'll be able to apply it. So that's a tax credit. It's not something you get as you go. It's really at the end of the year looking back. Common one, and we'll talk about, is the SR&ED tax credit. Grants, on the other hand, are different in the sense that you have to identify and apply for them, for the most part, before you actually incur the expense. So when you apply for a grant, you're often saying, okay, I'm looking for someone looking to hire, there's a hiring program, I'm going to apply for the grant, get accepted, and then hire that person and pay for their salary. Often, and this is where kind of disclaimer here, where we meet a lot of clients, will say, I spent all this money on this project, and we're like, it fit really well under this program, but unfortunately you've already kind of gone through the process of spending the money, and so now we can't go retroactively apply for the grant. So something to keep in mind is always kind of trying to forecast, look for the grants that may be applicable for a program that's for a project that it could be eligible for. So this is, again, I'm talking about timing here. So when, if we go to loans, so loans, as we know, many of us from our own personal experiences, same thing. You applied before, right? You want to go buy a house, you apply first for the loan, then you incur the expense and you buy the house. Same thing with corporate loans. So you want to apply first for the project, present your business case, get the loan, and then go forward. Loan guarantee. So this is one that often people are less familiar with. A loan guarantee, what it is really a way to reduce your risk when you take a corporate loan, often offered by the government. And so the way it works is that there will be a program under the government that will come and guarantee a loan that you're going to be taking out in order to minimize your risk, meaning that in the event of default, in the event that there's difficult situation in the company, you have less personal liability to the loan that was taken out. So often they'll go to like 70–80%, meaning you still have some liability, but less so than the full amount of the loan. So again, this would be something you would go apply for, get the loan guarantee, then go get the loan, and then go forward. With regards to equity, so this is the one where we often hear about, VCs, angel investors. This can be at any time. It has to be quite strategic, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it could be, throughout the process. And then obviously there are other types of funding mechanisms, and it's constantly evolving. But one of the examples being crowdfunding, and other vehicles for funding. The ones we're going to focus on today, primarily, I'm going to talk about non-dilutive funding, which really lies in the tax credit. So from the government, where you're not diluting yourself, the grants, and then some of the government loans as well. let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will move on if I can. Okay. Okay, so next we're going to go into who provides the funding and why. So if we look at tax credits, these are kind of in the law, right? So there is a tax law that's written that says, if you meet a certain criteria, you're allowed to, you're provided a certain tax credit on those expenses. So this is predefined. The financial motivation is really in the law. There is no expectation of return. There's no specific business model that you need to be pitching. You just basically need to meet the criteria that's in the law in order to receive that refund on the expenses. Next, if we go to grants, so grants, the financial motivation is very, we say, societal. So the way it works with a grant is really there'll be some kind of a mission and objective of the government, and this continues to evolve over the years and over the budgets that are announced. But the idea is that there'll be some kind of impact on society that they're looking to achieve with certain grants. So whether it be, more clean energy, more focus on women entrepreneurship, things like that they're aiming for, and so there'll be that financial motivation or that motivation behind the grant. With a grant, there is no expectation of refunding it, and so there is no expected return, which is nice. But they still will be looking at, is the company financially viable? Is there a business model that's in line with what we're looking to do? And so can they carry out the project? Or do we feel strongly enough that they'll be able to? So that's really where a grant fits in and why they'll fund it, really to achieve those societal objectives. Likewise with public loans, so it'll be very much aligned in that way. However, with a loan, as we know, there's a certain repayment schedule, certain interest that must be paid. The difference between a private and a public loan will really be at the typically at the interest level. So looking for lower and maybe even interest-free loans when we're looking at government loans. And the government will be looking at, a reasonable business model and different key considerations, whereas in a private one, they're looking at a certain return on their investment, right? So they're having the higher interest rates and certain revenue. They also will be looking closely at the assets and the cash flow in order to ensure that they have the stability to be able to refund or to pay back the loan. I guess that question come in. Any grants for research R&D only? Is the requirements for the company to partner with a public institution for grants? So there's different types of grants, not necessarily only for R&D, so it's across the board. My expertise, of course, is more so in the innovation space, but we also see, and I'm very familiar with the number of other ones. A good example will be, some programs around export, around hiring, which don't necessarily need to be in that scope. And we'll see a few later on. If I keep going here, so I mentioned that. So angel investors, obviously here we're getting into the higher return on their investment. So this is where they're taking a risk, right? They believe in the business model. They're looking for a certain return on their money, and that's really why they're doing this. They're going to be looking closely at the cash in the company and the cash flow. And typically they're looking for, over 20% return on their investment. Otherwise, they would likely go to more secure investments, right? But we talk about business model here. They got to really believe it to invest. Likewise with venture capital, where it's even riskier, larger amounts, right? And they're looking as such for larger return. And they'll be focusing on, your traction. And so that's where often we'll talk about in the next slide is when, but traction and product market fit, that's really what they're going to be focusing on. And key considerations for them will be, when can they exit on this to get that return that they're looking for. Okay, now if we look at how to look for funding, and this is an interesting slide where we've outlined a little bit of, the process or a recommended baseline process for how to approach the funding side in the funding world. And as we just saw, there's a number of different types of funding that's available. And, often some people will come to us and they're just getting going and they're like, okay, VC, this, that. But I think there's some low-hanging fruit and some other considerations before you jump to that, right? And VC and angel investors being the most, I would say, expensive out of all of the options. So good to take a look at some of these other ones and where the low-hanging fruit may be. So in terms of how and what the path is, if we start, at the beginning here, the idea is to first look at the project, the product that you're undertaking. And, first thing is to consider is commercial viable. Do we have a commercial viable product and a market for it? So what is the product market fit? That's probably at its core the first thing we need to think about before we go much further. Next thing would be the core team. So do I have a team? And if I'm maybe a founder, is there a co-founder that I should be looking for that could complement what I'm doing? So maybe I'm the core technical person and I need a counterpart that will focus more so on the financials, on the business, on the sales, and really kind of look at what does that look like and how can I complement my own skill set to make sure that we are well-rounded. So core team will be important, and this will be important throughout the search for funding, because it will be something that will be looked at quite closely, whether you're going to a government, to a bank, to an investor. So another important consideration. If we're not there yet, then maybe we need to build the team, right? Once we have a good commercially viable product market fit, we have the team, that's when the dirty little secret here is you need a little bit of cash in hand in order to then go forward and get more funding, right? So often a good place to start with this is looking at love money. So love money being friends, family, your own savings, and then going, that would also your own being the more so the bootstrap, right? So seeking a little bit of cash injection in order to then go to the next step. The other thing to consider is even with government funding from a grant or perspective, they'll never cover really 100% of the expenses, right? So they always want to see a little bit of cash that's put in, a little bit of skin in the game from the entrepreneur, from the company, to then build on that. But at the same time, it's smart business to say, what are the programs that exist in order for me to take my cash injection of, a few $100,000 and turn that into tens of thousands, right? So how can I create more runway for myself? So once we have that, that's then where, our recommendation is really to go into looking at the government funding. And that's what they're there for. That's what they're kind of the meaning and the goal of these programs is to fund different projects with different societal objectives. And so this is the low-hanging fruit and the least expensive. Same time, it's important to think about if I'm going to apply for a grant that's $500 and I'm going to take me 3 weeks to apply for it. Obviously, the return on investment is not there either. It ends up being more expensive, but being strategic with these and seeing where there's a fit is important. And that's where we'll talk a little bit more after. After this, after the grants and the government funding, probably makes sense can look at some loans. So if there's a cash flow restriction there, some loans can come and help. The cash flow history and the assets, the company and the individuals behind it are probably what will be looked at. And then finally, going into the other capitalization options through seeking some angels, VCs, or other could be an option at this stage. Again, keeping in mind, they're going to want to see that traction. They're going to want to see how they can, what that time to exit is for them, for that return on their investment. So this is kind of a recommended how and a path to funding. In terms of the different funding areas, so this is really what they're funding to a certain extent and how the non-dilutive space is segmented and structured, and kind of goes back to your question, who does, are they only funding innovation and R&D? But here we see kind of the different sides of it. So some of the main focus of the government funding that you will see first will be around workforce. So what they're trying to really promote is hiring, creating high value jobs. And so what we'll see is a lot of wage subsidies, a lot of programs around, hiring youth, new graduates, to help them gain that experience, as well as providing some grants and other programs around training. So this is an area whenever you have those types of expenses that are upcoming, good to maybe think, and take a look at what funding could I go get towards this investment in my workforce. So the largest portion, I will say, is really in the hire and the training of employees. Second would probably be around product development, research and development, working, yes, with partners in the public or private sector to build that level of innovation in Canada. And so product development is another main area of focus for funding. The third is really around marketing, exporting, commercialization. So really, particularly around in Canada, we'll be going outside your own province. So once you've established yourself in Quebec, there's good programs for, right now it's called the PSCE. So going outside the province, but still in Canada, but also could go outside Canada. Really, conferences, travel, marketing expenses, things like that could be covered under this area of focus for funding. And the last one would likely be around capital expenditures. So if your project requires large capital investments, putting together a pilot, a manufacturing line, doing some kind of showcase where you need to buy, hardware and put it in real situations, things like that. There's also a number of programs around that. So the idea here is just to show you kind of the focus in the areas where the spending is often quite subsidized. So the main areas. So now we're going to go into maybe some high level of the main programs that we see are well used, that work well, that are really good programs and if they do fit for your business, kind of very interesting and smart to maybe think about how there's a fit. So first slide here is on tax credits, and then I have one on grants. On the tax credit side, I'll go pretty briefly on each. If you have any questions, again, don't hesitate to ask about them. I'd be happy to answer. So on the tax credit side, these are some of the main ones, and we are, I think, mostly in Quebec. So I'll speak to the Quebec, rates as well. Although some of these programs do have equivalents across the country. So if you have offices elsewhere, there may be potential as well. So the SR&ED tax credit, this is one of the largest and most, I could say, known tax credits in the innovation space for companies. The idea with the SR&ED tax credit is really to subsidize the risk that companies take when they do research and development. The goal being to, advance knowledge of the technical workforce as they work through these iterations that they may have, successful and unsuccessful, right? So if the main criteria for an SR&ED project is at the project level, and what we look at and typically is looked at by CRA for eligibility will be that there's a technological advancement that is sought. So you're looking to advance technology, science compared to the current state of the art. So what's available, what's in literature, what you can, pull from open source. That's the baseline that you're looking to go beyond. Second, that there's a technological uncertainty. So there's uncertainty as to how you'll be able to achieve those advancements that you're looking to achieve. And then third, that there's a systematic approach. So opposite would be trial and error. Systematic is, I have a design, I have a hypothesis, I build a prototype, I test it, I analyze it. Based on my results, I go back, I have a new hypothesis, and so on and so forth. So kind of like high school chemistry, hypothesis, design, testing, analysis, conclusion. The rates in Quebec for this on salaries can go up to 74%. So an interesting and high rate, one of the largest in Canada. So kind of well positioned when we're in Quebec to take advantage of this program. And the idea is, when I say that percentage, is really for a Canadian controlled private company in Quebec. So $100 spent on research and development, you would get a refundable, so a cash refund of $74 on that salary, which is quite high. In this case, there's a federal program, there's a provincial program, so I've combined the two in that rate, but interesting and great program to work with. Second one is the e-business tax credit. This one's a little bit less known, but works also very well. So this is a provincial tax credit in Quebec that's available to companies that are developing software that's B2B, and that helps improve business processes. So what that means is that it was originally really created as a tax credit that would subsidize, development of ERP type systems, so really management software. But it's broadened. Typical examples, of course, are, if you're developing a software that helps with inventory management or with, like a CRM or things like that. But it can really go across any type of software that, allows for some type of intelligence, insights, improved efficiency and productivity at another business, right? So you got to be selling B2B, so to another client that's a business. In this case, there's a 30% tax credit that's available on salaries of employees that are working on the software development lifecycle, the whole thing, really from speccing it out to UI UX to designing it, prototyping it, launching it, and then customization, deployment, all of it. Great program as well. Again, provincial. And it's the one caveat here is you must have a minimum of 6 eligible employees in order to be eligible for the program. So it's not really at that early startup phase, but once you've reached that 6 core technical team, it kicks in, and great program to take advantage. Third one here, multimedia tax credit. This tax credit is really one originally for the gaming industry. So this is the reason why we have in Quebec, and there are equivalents to this program across provinces, but in Quebec we have a great one that goes up to 37.5% of multimedia title. And what that means is what's eligible is really any title, any software, any solution that is truly interactive to the level of a game, right? So games fit in right away, but then it could be other things too. So e-learning applications, for example, it could also be simulation type software, things like that, where there's true interactivity. There has to be a minimum of 3 of text, sound, images, and video. And of course needs to be on a software medium and destined for launch. So another important factor here is that it needs to go to market. So this is a 37.5% tax credit, or up to if there's a French translation. If not, we fall to the 30%. And last one I'll mention in the tax credit is a very easy one and great one, and we've used it internally, and it's one that I always recommend, is the co-op internship tax credit. This tax credit is automatic, so when you're hiring interns, if you do hire from one of the universities that offers a co-op program, which is now most, if the student's in the co-op program, you'll be able to get at the first 2 years, it's a 24% tax credit, and then it goes to 40% in your 3rd year and beyond. So once you get into that 40% range, it's probably the highest tax credit provincially you can get. And in combination with some of the also internship grants, can be quite interesting and help subsidize the overall internship costs. So when you have the choice between someone that is in a co-op program and isn't, this could be a consideration. Also a good one to claim kind of on a continuous basis over those first few years in order to get to that 40% zone. Then if we go to the grants, so one of the main grants in the R&D and innovation space would be the IRAP program. So this is a federal program, very similar to the SR&ED tax credit that we mentioned earlier, but instead of it being a tax credit, which you would apply for at the end of the year, this is a grant. So you would really be able to apply before you start the project, and then you can do monthly reimbursement claims. So it really helps with cash flow on an innovation program. Of course, when you are getting a grant, it will reduce your tax credit, right? So we'll talk about stacking a little bit after, but you can combine these tax credits with the grants, but there's different limits to which you can, and then there's consideration with respect to the tax credit and how it's impacted by the program that you've applied for and obtained. So IRAP, the way it works too, kind of a different process where you'd first connect with the NRC, you would have an initial meeting, you'll be assigned a representative, you talk about your project. They will want to see both the R&D innovation side as well as the business side. So they look at it a little bit like an investor. And key points that I always mention are, whenever you're going after a grant, whenever you're going after one of these programs, is obviously be prepared, put your best foot forward. But in this case, it's almost like you're pitching to an investor. And what you want to highlight is your growth with respect to the team. So, if you can highlight how many and who you're going to be hiring, they always want to see the hiring landscape. And then on the other side, when do you expect you'll achieve break even or even profitability? And thinking about it from a government perspective, they're investing in your project, in you, where they're looking to maybe recapture, even though early on I said, there is no recapture required. They're looking to create jobs, right? And they recapture a little bit on the income tax at that point, and they're looking to grow your business in order to then recapture a little bit from corporate taxes, right? So kind of keeping that in mind can sometimes help you align your presentation and your discussions with the government entities. So IRAP, great program. Sometimes, kind of gets capped out. It's a popular one, so the budget runs out. Another thing to know is government budgets really get renewed at the beginning of April. So the fiscal year for the government is April to end of March. Right now, being in April, it's a great time. Everything's been, refilled. But good to get started on these discussions earlier rather than later. And they can go and fund, we've seen up to 80% of labor expenditures. During COVID, it went up to 100 in certain cases. Those have no longer exist, but it's quite generous as well in terms of how much they'll fund. The SWPP grant, this is a grant towards interns, works really well, goes up to $7,500 per internship, so per semester, which is typically a 16-week period. This in combination with the co-op grant can be quite lucrative. So you can use and apply for this grant. The way this one works is it'll be through different sponsoring organizations. So depending on if you're in the software or you're in the biotech space, you'll go to different groups to apply for it, but it's the same federal budget that's across these. So there's things like BioTalent for the bio side. There's Technation when we're looking at the software side. There's many. So I'm just mentioning a few here. So another great one, MyTax, another great organization, federal, so works across Canada towards helping companies hire more at the master's PhD level, so more at the graduate level. They'll also come and subsidize a portion of the cost of hiring. They're interns, so in theory, they're supposed to be working, on their thesis as well as with the professor at the university and on your project. Sometimes it's nice when you're able to connect with certain universities and groups that are aligned with your project objectives. What I like about MyTax too that works well is that they'll actually connect you. So you can meet with somebody at MyTax, tell them, here's the area that I'm interested in hiring around or getting support. And they will say, okay, although you're based in Montreal, there's University of, in BC, there's a professor, there's a lab that's doing this, there could be a good fit, and they'll connect you. So that's a great asset to have as well. So I'm going kind of fast over these, but don't hesitate if you have any questions. Next, I'm going to go into how to combine. So I've mentioned this a little bit throughout, but as I said earlier, most programs will reimburse between 30 to 50% of eligible expenditures. Some will go higher. So I would say the highest is probably 80%, again, because they want to see a little bit of skin in the game from the company. But there is some possibility to also combine. So if there's one program that subsidizes 30% and there's another program that subsidizes, 70%, well, now you're kind of thinking, okay, I got 100%, but unfortunately, in most of these contracts, there will be a stacking limit, they refer to it, which is really a cap on how much government funding you can combine. Often that cap, will be around the 70% mark. Again, varies and probably something you can negotiate at contract signing. It's in the fine print, so you need to look for it, but to consider. And in this case, let's say you have the 30% one, you use that, and then you'll use the next one for the 40%, even though it's a 70% grant, you won't be able to use it fully, but up to the cap, right? And these are things to consider. Also, in these cases, you need to consider, the period that's being covered, the expense, and other expenses. A little bit of a wording thing, but sometimes it won't be just the cap will not be on just the expenses that are being subsidized, but it'll be on the whole project cost. So sometimes you got to map that out a little bit. So there's an exercise here, but to know when you are thinking about combining. And this is something too that, if you do need help on, this is something we do often, and happy to help kind of talk through. The idea is always to maximize between them all and make it all work, so that you can, leverage your own investment furthest. Some recommendations in terms of how to maximize your chances of success. One thing is to, obviously be well aware of what funding opportunities exist and evaluate them based on your project and your needs. The idea is not the other way around, which sometimes we see where people say, oh, there's a program to fund, this type of development of a clean tech solution. Maybe we can reorient to fit into this program. I think definitely need to look at it the other way around. What am I doing? How am I mapping out my project over the next 6 months to a year? And then is there a program that fits and is aligned? But make sure one is to stay aware, right? So if you don't know about a program, unfortunately, you'll fully miss it. And then two, once you identify one, is really understand, what is the opportunity? What are the objectives? And is there an alignment? And then once you apply, make sure you highlight where that alignment is, right? So that's really what they're evaluating. Each program has different objectives, different requirements, and you want to make sure there's a fit and that you can highlight that fit. Last one here is kind of plan out each step of your project. So again, a best practice is to really think about what does the budget look like? How is it going to be set up so that you can do that presentation and showcase that this program is really a fit and that it would really impact your bottom line in terms of your capability to pursue the project. Next, I'll talk about Fundica a little bit. So I mentioned it early on. The idea with Fundica too was, we were working from a consulting perspective with a number of companies across Canada, different size, different industry. There's a ag tech in BC versus an AI software in Montreal company. Funding is different types. And, we had Excel where we were trying to keep track of it all. And ultimately it became quite tedious. And so we decided, there must be a smarter way to do this, a more intelligent way to sort through these. And that's really where the idea for Fundica came. The idea is that it allows you to put in some information on the company. So you put in your postal code, the size of the number of employees, your industry, and based on that, it will do a search to identify which programs exist. The way it works in terms of the database too, it's constantly kept up to date. Here we're kind of showcasing that we have internet bots, we have dedicated researchers that are maintaining this database of different programs up to date with the criteria that would be necessary. So if I show it to you, this is a little bit what it's going to look like once you do put in and create an account. So it's totally free. All you have to do is, as I said, put in some minimum criteria, and then you'll see a list of different programs. So this is kind of what you would see. You can also favorite some, put them in your heart tab. Otherwise, you'll see the grants, the tax credits, the loans, loan guarantees, things like that. And you can go through it. The ones that are of interest, you bookmark, and then you'll see them in your favorites. Once you click on them, I guess I didn't put that slide. You'll also see a one-pager detailing, what are the costs that are covered. It'll also give you the link to the program, and if there's an application or other, you'll see it right in there. So it's a powerful tool. It's something that's really there for you to leverage as it makes sense. I invite you all to maybe just try it out. If you have any feedback, I'm always interested to hear that. But it's available to you for free as a resource to identify different sources of funding. I'll put the link at the end of the presentation too, if you want to, when you want to go check it out. I'll leave you, and I am right on time, with some best practices. So I think overall, from what we've seen today, are my recommendations, of course, from a best practices perspective, and it might be different for different situations, but I think the way to go is really to look at, start with the product market fit. Then you go from government to bank to VC. That seems to be the optimized way, the way to go from least expensive in terms of dilution, cost, time, from the government to the VCs. I think when you're looking at these programs too, it's to really take the time to understand them. What are they looking? What's the societal objective that they're looking to achieve? How are you aligned in that way? And make sure that there's a really mutually win-win relationship between you and the program. As well, when you're preparing the submission, put together your best foot forward, killer pitch, killer application, just like you're pitching at any other competition. The idea is to put that together and to move the deal to a close as fast and as best you can. So I think that is the presentation. This is also the link to where you can go check out, the tool to identify different sources of funding. It's really, if you go directly to Fundica, it's more information on our white label. But if you go here on our R&D partners site, we have the white label integrated and open to you all to leverage and use. So thanks everyone. Yeah, thanks Nadia for putting that in. Hopefully there's some things you're able to take away from this today. You've learned a little bit, and I'd love to connect with you beyond that too, as it makes sense. I see, should I try to take some of these questions in the chat?
Yeah.
Or do we want to go to a different Q&A style?
No, if
okay.
if you see any questions that you want to answer, please go forward. Thank you so much, Sahar. It was really great. So everyone, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, or if you want to, get off mute, raise your hand, and we can have you off mute and ask your questions as well.
Yeah, sure. So maybe I'll start with this one. So Nadia is saying we encourage collaboration between universities and companies. Okay. As academics, we sometimes struggle to find common topics with companies that require commercially viable. Do you have any advice for us? Yeah, I mean, I think this is the struggle that's existed for a long time. I think it's getting better too. There are some different alignments between companies and academia that are coming into place, and I think some of these programs are meant to mitigate that. In terms of specific advice, I mean, I think again at the end of the day, it's kind of what I was saying earlier, but you gotta, when you partner with any company or any academic group, you need to make sure it's a winning partnership, right? So I think the time spent to make sure that you can commit to the commercial product from an academic perspective, and from a commercial perspective that that you can work with the team towards that goal in a reasonable timeline and within the different requirements. It's a discussion. So I don't really have any specific advice here, but I will say that there's a number of different programs from a collaboration between academic and industry that should be looked at, and that can be leveraged in those cases. Okay, let me know guys if you have any questions. Otherwise, yeah, I can stop sharing, and if you'd like to open your cameras or if you have any questions, I'm kind of here. And add me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to connect that way as well. Are there tax credits only for companies, or can they be applied to universities? So the university have their own mechanism with the grants and other programs. I would say I'm less familiar with that. I'm more familiar on the corporate tax credits and funding. But a number of the collaborative programs where it's between academic and university, the funding actually goes straight to the university. So although it's a program you'll apply to conjunctly with between the company and the university, often it'll just help increase the pool of funds that are available for the academic project. So that's one way. Yeah, so that's one way you'll see it often. Okay, yeah. Thanks for the feedback, Rachel.
I
Yeah,
have a question for you. So you know how you mentioned very early in the process, well, you have your idea, now you need to have the killer team. Can you speak a bit more about what the team should be? Because I'm guessing everyone here is more, the tech side. I
yeah.
understand we need a business person, but if you can elaborate on this, that would be great.
Yeah, and I think it depends a little bit on the type of company, but I think you definitely need a strong business counterpart, right? So if you are really the lead on the technical, some of the main things that you have to think about is that there will be corporate overhead just in running a business, right? So from a administrative, accounting, that's kind of the basics. And then often really in order to get your product to grow, you're going to need that sales and marketing person, right? That person that can build those relationships, those partnerships, that can identify where we have a product market fit, but is it here in, should we go after the market in Montreal and Quebec, or should we go straight to the US? Like there are some key decisions to be made in order to accelerate your path to growth. So you need somebody to be thinking about that. That's not focused. Sometimes we're too close to the product, right? We're too close to the technology that we don't kind of have the time even to look and take a step back and look at that. So having that counterpart, I think is quite important. And I think from a investor government funding point of view, they're going to want to see that as well. So that's important to be well-rounded. And it doesn't often or always need to be a co-founder or a team member. Sometimes a strong board can also come and complement you in a large way as well. Some key partnerships or mentors that you can, identify as part of the, the bubble that you're growing in your network, that's supporting you through this. So that can be, and some of them can be potential clients, some of them can be potential future partners. It really goes across the board.
Awesome. Thank you. Any other questions for Sahar?
All right, super clear. If you have any specific questions for you, as I said, like feel free to message me separately. But yeah, I'm here for, I guess, kind of finishing it off, but happy to answer any general questions for everybody.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, then I just want to say, thank you very much, Sahar. This was very, very good presentation. Everything was clear, and I have to say, at least for myself, my questions were answered as you were going through the slides. And thank you everyone for being here as well.